In Eastern philosophy, there's a concept known as the 8 worldly winds or conditions. The 8 worldly winds consist of 4 attachments and their 4 corresponding fears, which we cycle through and are pulled by endlessly throughout our lives. It's an interesting metaphor calling them the 8 worldly winds because just like the winds constantly change, so do these conditions. They are an integral part of our lives, and our lives largely depend on these conditions. So these are the 8 worldly winds: happiness and suffering, fame and insignificance, praise and blame, gain and loss. So we are naturally in disharmony with these conditions. We often feel overly excited and overly attached in the first half of the conditions, and we often feel overly miserable and hopeless when experiencing the second half. These conditions form our lives, so we obsess over them constantly, and this causes an inner turmoil. But the reality is each condition, good or bad, is transient. They happen over and over again in an endless cycle. There is no telling which way the winds will go, and we have little to no control over them. They largely depend on external factors. These conditions are never complete or fixed. There is always more or less to them. So no matter which condition we're in, we'll always be in the same position. It's a constant pursuit for something that can never truly be reached. Even people we perceive as enjoying the good are not free of these conditions, because that is the nature of the 8 worldly winds. They are constantly shifting. Bad conditions, of course, we don't want to happen, but in a way they are integral to life and so inevitable. But it's important to remember that they are transient. They too will pass. On the other hand, when we get too attached when the conditions are in our favor, when the winds change, we're in for a storm. So I think it's very important that we always carry out the best action we can, and not to be too attached to the outcome, the results, because the nature of the winds is they will never always be in our favor. It's not exactly in our control, but I think it's also very important to trust in the nature of the shifting of the winds. Now, it's a lot easier said than done, but I think the goal here is to, instead of being overly attached when the winds change in your direction, or instead of being overly miserable when experiencing the bad conditions, I think we need to practice equanimity, a type of emotional stability. This doesn't mean no happiness when good things happen or no sadness when bad things happen. I think that's impossible. And we all know suppression is unhealthy. It's more learning not to be disturbed by the constantly shifting direction of the winds, not being overly attached or overly repelled, a sort of middle line. And I think this middle line is optimum for allowing us to respond to the shifting of winds in an appropriate and calm way. Of course, a lot easier said than done, requires a lot of practice. I haven't mastered it, but it is indeed a very important practice.